Hello, greetings to everyone out there. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd also like to say special thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the DT Institute, and my colleagues on the Atlantic Council, without whom this dialogue would not have been possible. Most importantly, of course, I would like to thank the dialogue participants whose deep and diverse expertise gave substance to this report. And on that note, I'd like to point out that this report represents a synthesis of the variety of opinions expressed by these participants. They represented different nationalities, backgrounds, experiences, and professional opinions. So while there was a great deal of agreement on the best path forward for Iraq, participation does not entail agreement with all the report's descriptions and recommendations. To the extent possible, the report tries to identify those areas and promote further discussion, some of which we hope will begin today with today's panel discussion. Now, as most are aware, this dialogue built on a previous one from March 2020 that was held in Berlin, which identified specific interventions that Iraq and its partners could undertake to improve governance, services, and security. Specifically, that dialogue, that session identified civil service, youth mobilization, distribution of authorities, and militia integration as particular areas for focus. The second round began in August of 2020 and sought to update those recommendations and turn them into actual policies, as well as identifying the actors, acts, and conditions necessary for their implementation. Unfortunately, by then, the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing and participants could not travel and conduct sessions in person. So we met once a month for the next 5 months, and participants incrementally developed what we hope is a roadmap that accounts for how these measures and other interventions in combination will help take Iraq from its current state to one of relative stability and prosperity. Now, yesterday's attack in Erbil underscores the urgency of this project, and our hearts and prayers go out to those killed and injured in the attack. However, the hope, however, is that we are at a moment where a multilateral and comprehensive approach can break down the barriers to reform, reconstruction, and recovery. And that is what we hope to explore to some degree today with the panel, moderated by Louisa Lovelock, Washington Post Baghdad bureau chief. However, before that, we are fortunate to hear from His Excellency Martin Huth, the European Union ambassador to Iraq, who will deliver our keynote. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction, and let me also join you right at the beginning to also join you in expressing condolences for the victims and the families of victims of yesterday's attack. I would also like to thank you for allowing me to provide a few observations at the start of this conference, and I will try to make my remarks relevant to the findings in the excellent joint report by the Atlantic Council and Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and to also point out where the European Union in various areas identified in the report is already active. And in doing so, I will speak about what I perceive as three main axes around which the current Iraqi situation revolves and which make up the perfect storm that the country is facing. These are the question of a state, the economy, and the regional context. And in trying to address these three areas, I will also try to pick up on a few issues on which I feel the report invites a discussion. Let me start by saying that when in 2019, I learned of my appointment to become EU ambassador to Iraq, some Arab friends, notably of my generation and a little bit older, they reacted with shining eyes and they told me about Iraq and the personal prestige it holds for them in terms of the land, its culture and civilization. They were in fact happy for me to come here. And I think it is important to mention this at a time when Iraq is indeed facing multiple severe challenges, which are compounded by both the COVID situation and an unstable regional environment. And this leads me to the first of the three axes, where I have to underline that while the state in Iraq may appear to be in crisis, one should not forget that Iraq is a country with all its relevant attributes. And since Iraqis have a strong sense of belonging to this country, the first and most important prerequisite for having a state is fulfilled beyond a shred of doubt. But what actually appears to be under siege is both the functionality and the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. It's good to see, as the report points out, that over the years, ethno-sectarian divisions are somewhat lessening and that an Iraqi national identity is gaining in strength. And this is somewhat reflected in the fact that the constant and prevailing demand throughout the demonstrations that we have witnessed since October 2019, the main line, so to say, has been Nuridu Dawla, we want a state. In my view, this demand is as remarkable as it is mature in a region where some states are either facing fragmentation or significant weakening. And this all too often due to the existence of powerful non-state actors or even foreign states, or when the notion and desirability of having a state is even questioned. In Iraq, people seem to be aware of the threat of non-state actors to their nationhood and the constant risk of fragmentation. And I would say that as European Union, we need to pick up on this popular demand and should actively contribute to empowering the Iraqi state so that it can fulfill the expectations placed on it. Of course, we do not ignore the existence and factual power that non-state groups and forces have, but they cannot and must not be a primary interlocutor. I'm saying this because there is an emerging trend also in academia that suggests that more attention should be given to and more interaction should take place with powerful non-state actors, since they, as is alleged, yield real power. But real power, in my view, does not belong in their hands. And I need not remind us that security and the monopoly of the use of coercive force are the exclusive prerogative of the state. It's often said that the Iraqi problem is related to the negative aspects of the ethno-sectarian model of power sharing, the Muhassasa system, which was introduced after 2003 due to the then prevailing conditions and views. And while it is obvious that Muhassasa has its clear limits in Iraq as in Lebanon, it is interesting to note that the report states that for various reasons, Muhassasa is unlikely to go in the short term. In any case, one must concede the existence of ethnic and confessional identities in Iraq, and also concede that these identities must at least not necessarily supersede an Iraqi identity. So if we assume that these points reflect reality, then this gives rise to the question whether, as long as least as it is deemed either necessary or unavoidable, there can be a good and accountable version of Muhassasa, a version that would hold up the notion of citizenship within a democratic order. So the real question here is whether Muhassasa is reformable and improvable. Of course, an Iraqi identity becomes hollow without an accompanying sense of citizenship, and no state can exist without a strong mutual bond between itself and its citizens. Instead of seeing this as a chicken or egg question, what comes first, the state or the notion of citizenship, both notions need to be reinforced and empowered. Just as much as citizens should expect a state that is accountable and provides its services through functioning institutions, a state requires also law-abiding, working, and tax-paying citizens. And defining this mutual relationship and putting it on a healthy and sustainable basis would be essential in formulating a social contract between Iraqis themselves and between them and the state. And this is why, as European Union, we have noted with great interest the inclusion in the government program of the idea of holding a national dialogue where all the already mentioned issues can be discussed and which could, in fact, result in the formulation of such a social contract. As a final point on the issue of state, the report correctly points out the need for Parliament to fully exercise its functions responsibly and in the interest of the common good. The more this becomes a reality, the more one can then focus not so much, as the report says, on the non-accountability of Parliament, but rather on the government's accountability to Parliament. Turning to the second axis, I would like to stress the absolute and overriding need for the Iraqi economy to reform, and for Iraqi citizens to understand this need. We see this as if not the priority for the country. And as Iraq is facing multiple political and socio-economic crises, this may well be the last opportunity to achieve what must inevitably be a completely new economic model for Iraq, the components of which are also clearly laid out in the report. Fortunately, there now is considerable momentum in Iraq towards these reforms, driven by the Minister of Finance, Ali Alawi, supported by the Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi, and embodied in the white paper and its implementation matrix that was recently adopted by the Council of Ministers. Here, of course, I do not have to preach to the converted and speak of the need to diversify, create investment opportunities, and revive the agricultural sector, while severely curtailing spending in other areas such as salaries. What is important, however, is the time factor, not just in terms of economic loss or gains, but politically. Iraq is moving towards early parliamentary elections in October, and it would seem absolutely crucial to achieve a measure of visible and tangible reforms until then, lest elections throw this process into limbo or worse, oblivion. The international community, notably in the shape of the G7, together with the EU and Saudi Arabia, have recently joined forces by creating the Iraq Economic Contact Group, to nudge and support Iraq towards reform, to coordinate our efforts amongst ourselves, and to eventually provide much needed financial support. Let me add that the EU is also a pioneer in implementing various programs aimed at fighting corruption and improving public finance management. Specifically, in this economic context, the strained relationship between Baghdad and Erbil and their ongoing dispute about the allocation of oil revenues and the funding of the KRI's budget has the capacity to derail the entire economic reform process. And while this process is to a considerable extent rooted in mistrust, resentment, and even centrifugal tendencies, it all comes to bear heavily with the economic dimension. Over the last months, we've seen how central Iraq's economic crisis has also hit KRI, and that no part of Iraq is therefore immune from the disastrous effects of decade-long mismanagement and corruption. Therefore, I think the message must be clear that this is not the time for Baghdad and Erbil to fight and scramble for scarce resources, but to come together, agree on reform, and to find a sustainable distribution mechanism. And also to explain all of this to their citizens through regular and consistent communication. Turning to the last of my three axes, the regional dimension of Iraq's problems, it would seem obvious that the creation of an internal balance through economic reform and by strengthening the state-citizen relationship cannot be successful as long as it is not also accompanied by an equilibrium in Iraq's foreign relations. Due to its geographic position, Iraq has always been and will always be a bridge between nations and people, hence its need to maintain the best possible relations with all its neighbors. We in the EU are very happy to see that under the present government, there is the emergence of an Iraqi foreign policy doctrine that strives precisely to achieve that very balance in foreign relations, a balance that is both politically and economically beneficial for Iraq. Just as much as the country is reaching out to the GCC countries and undertaking first steps towards a measure of regional economic integration with both Egypt and Jordan, it cannot ignore its historic, cultural, and economic links with both Iran and Turkey. At least in theory, this approach should provide for multiple win-win situations within the region and with Iraq as a centerpiece. As both Prime Minister Al-Kazemi and Foreign Minister Hussein have repeatedly stressed, these relations must be maintained on an equal level and with full respect for Iraqi sovereignty. Obviously, these are not one-way streets, and the realization of such a foreign policy vision requires the convergence of insights and interests from all concerned sides. I do not need to touch upon the importance for the international coalition against Daesh to remain in Iraq, since this is evident to all. What is also evident is that Iraq must not be the permanent proxy battlefield it has so often been. Yesterday's attack on coalition facilities in Erbil was another reminder of this unfortunate situation. This attack actually comes after it was good to see how all concerned parties, including Iraq and Iran, have contributed to keeping the sensitive period between the 3rd of November and the 20th of January altogether calm. I would sincerely hope that US-Iranian relations will eventually take a turn for the better, and that this will allow for added breathing space for Iraq to move forward. Iraq is a country where the well-known dictum of being too big to fail can only be called another tourism. And while international focus is altogether too often elsewhere, for example, on Syria and Iran, this country needs active attention and support in view of both the positive and negative potential it holds. Thank you.
I would just like to turn it over to the panelists to kind of to provide an opening statement regarding your reaction to the report, what you find, and anything important that you'd like to highlight regarding the report and the way ahead for Iraq. And in no particular order, Ambassador Blakua, if you'd like to begin, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, while we wait for Luis, I think certainly what Ambassador Martin Huth has very eloquently pointed are basically the main challenges that Iraq is facing, and I think that this report tries to address. I think to empower the Iraqi state, as it has been pointed, we have to understand, of course, that the hybrid nature of that state does not allow for the maybe traditional recipes or solutions to be applied. I believe that that this report has as one of its main strengths is a very pragmatic roadmap, and the fact that it's called precisely a roadmap for recovery is very much at the heart of the whole exercise. In my view, the key to address these challenges that are well known, that have been, I think, very well pointed in the report, and that we all know, and most of the Iraqi analysts share, is how those actors, the very multiple actors, both Iraqi and external, both state and non-state, can be brought to support what in this report is called a grand bargain. And I think we have to be extremely pragmatic here. And there is a course of action that will be the condition for many of these reforms to take place, both in the economic, security, constitutional terms. And I think the grand bargain is obviously the result of a political dialogue that includes the most relevant political actors, but that is not enough. The grand bargain is just the beginning of the, I mean, not the beginning, but maybe the middle stage of the process in which other non-state actors, Iraqi civil society, what has been known as the protest movement, and many other relevant and influential actors can be brought in. So I think there is a process in which political dialogue will be the precondition for this grand bargain to take place. And this grand bargain has to lead to a new social contract. So I think this report and the discussions that have led to these conclusions, and I think the report is quite pragmatic, is really avoids big theoretical discussions and points at the key issues, goes or is articulated around this idea. So I think the way that this report can be useful is basically that it provides Iraqis with a sort of a series of steps, but at the same time, it gives the international community also some guidelines on how to support an Iraqi that needs to be, or a process that needs to be Iraqi-led. So I will leave it at that, and I will let my fellow panelists really move on the.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. I think we've got Louisa back on, and so I'm going to turn it back over to her to continue the discussion. Thanks, everybody, for your patience. And we can't hear you still if you're talking. No. All right. I think we'll move on to Ambassador Rahim. I know you've got some comments, particularly on the way forward in terms of bringing Iraq's disparate factions together. So I'd like to turn it over to you now to remark on that, or anything else you want to.
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me?
I hear you fine.
Great, excellent. First of all, let me just say that this is really a groundbreaking report, and it certainly identifies the problems, and I think very importantly, it shows how these problems are interlocking. In other words, there are no discrete problems to be addressed, but they're all sort of interdependent, and it is not possible to treat one without the other, and so on. And I think that's a very useful approach that was taken by the report, because frequently we tend to think in sort of one problem and then the next and so on. It doesn't work like that in Iraq. It's a big task, but we need to recognize that it's all interlocking, and it certainly provides the kernels of ideas for the way forward. There aren't any actual solutions, but there are suggestions for ways to go to solutions. So I would like to comment a little bit on this grand bargain that Ambassador Lecour mentioned. And yeah, a grand bargain is probably necessary in Iraq, and it could be done through dialogue, it can be done through constitutional means, but a grand bargain is always an agreement among political elites. And these political elites, if they do a grand bargain, are going to simply redivide, reallocate the prerogatives, interests, spoils, etc. It'll be a redistribution of power among existing actors. And I think the problem in Iraq, and the report mentions it in many places, goes much deeper than a real allocation of power among existing players. Because what the protests showed us is that there is a real crisis of identity and belonging among the Iraqi people, which cannot be resolved by a grand bargain. And what the most significant, symbolic, emotional, in a way, phrase that was used was Nurid Watan, not Nurid Dawla, as Ambassador Huth mentioned, Nurid Watan, which is actually much more powerful because what it means, Watan is patria. It's not a state, it's not a government, it's not a country. It's something that you feel you belong to, you can be proud of. And the problem that was raised in this expression and in the rejection of the political process is that a great majority of the Iraqi people, and particularly the Shia, whose state it is supposed to be, by the way, feel an alienation from the state. This country, or the state that is in this country, does not represent them. They cannot identify with it. They certainly can't be proud of it. So it's not just a question of services, it's really a question of the nature of the state itself and to what extent the state actually represents its citizenship. The notion of citizenship was very prominent in the protests. And we talk about the protest of 2019, but everybody should remember that the protests are going on today. They're going on in the south, in Babil, in Wasat, in Nasriya, and so on. So it's not as if they happened and they were over. Certainly the thrust of them has been diminished, but they're still going on. So the sense of citizenship, the sense of wanting a country for all its people was very prominent and is still prominent in this new rhetoric. And my fear is that if we concentrate on the grand bargain, we're not going to solve the problem. What is evident is that there is a challenge to the state, whether it is this bargain or another grand bargain, that these bargains are being challenged by the state, by the citizens. They are challenging the existing order, and they will challenge any new order that does not take the notion of citizenship, of watan, and a watan for all its inhabitants and not for the select few. If those challenges are not addressed, and particularly not addressed by the Shia political parties, I want to add. Everybody has remarked on the fact that the protests were in the Shia heartland, they are by the Shia, and since the state is dominated and controlled and coerced and co-opted by the Shia political parties, then opposing the state as it is now is opposing the Shia political parties. We have a real challenge and a real confrontation, I think. And what we need to look at is what is the pathway to responding to these deep existential demands of the protesters? What is the pathway to beginning to respond to those demands, while at the same time perhaps holding a grand bargain protocol or system? We cannot take the grand bargain without addressing these very existential demands of belonging, of representation, of feeling a pride in one's citizenship. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rahim. I think we're going to try Louisa again. Are you out there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Great.
Great. Sorry, I'm in the UK. Just having a few problems right now, so the internet appears to be one of them. Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard all of the discussion, but just sort of, if I can just continue with Dr. Rahim briefly, you know, this report makes a lot of very sort of far-reaching recommendations, very ambitious recommendations. But as the ambassador has been saying, one of the biggest impediments to reform over time has been a total lack of willingness on the part of the political elite to do anything other than sort of share the wealth around in sort of different ways each time, to cut up the pie, and to not bring anyone in. A major theme of this report is the importance of youth participation. This is a country with a major youth bulge. These people will be its future. And I wonder, Ambassador, if you could speak a little bit about, you know, if the protesters and the protesters' demands are to be sort of taken seriously, if their leaders or their foot soldiers are to be brought into the political system in any way, you know, what paths forward exist for that? You know, as you say, this is a very top-down system and not one where there are many routes in.
Are you asking me?
I'm throwing that open to anyone. Sorry, I've switched onto my phone, so I can't see who's talking. But that is wide open.
Well, if I may jump,
what did you...
sorry.
Yeah, please. No.
I gather you want to hear from Ren, so why don't we let her speak?
No, carry on, please.
Well, I have to say that I think that this calls for a grand bargain and for this sort of even loftier ambition of creating sort of a sense of belonging. I agree with Ren that the grand bargain is between the elites, and I also agree with her that the protesters want something else. But I must say, I mean, there is a grand bargain. The Muhassasa system is a part of that grand bargain, and as the report says, that's unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon. I'm not so convinced, however, that the protests are divorced from a lack of services and a lack of good governance. Because I think that is a part of what the protests are actually about. They're about the lack of economic opportunity. They're about a lack of seeing a future in Iraq by the youth. And that, I think, very much has to do with the lack of good governance. I think that sense of disenfranchisement, that separation from the elites in the country very much contributes to this sense of not belonging to the country and the direction in which the elites are driving the country. And therefore, I actually believe that to the extent that the report, whether directly or indirectly, elevates the issue of good governance, I think it directly relates to the demands of the protesters, because if you can engender good governance, something Iraq has been lacking for a very long time, long before 2003, I think you can begin to engage that sense of belonging to a polity, which at least is a beginning. It's not the same as being a part of the patria that Ren talked about, but at least it is a beginning. It is a sense of belonging to a political order that has your interests at heart. And I don't think we ought to discount that that is a part of what the protesters mean, at least at some relatively superficial level, necessary but not sufficient, when they say that they want Nuridu Watan.
And so, I mean, on this point about good governance, because this is, it's a word that you hear so often, and yet which there is so little of in Iraq. What interventions are there? What challenges are there to achieving that? What would you say there?
Well, I mean, I uh, often critique the Constitution, and there are a lot of flaws in the Constitution. One of the things I think the report says correctly is that although there are problems with the Constitution, there doesn't seem to be, at least this was the sense of the participants, there's not a desire amongst the existing political elites to reopen the Constitution. And that's fine, because there are actually things that one can use the Constitution, can use actually the flaws of the Constitution to to begin to solve the problems if there's a will amongst the political class to do so. One can be skeptical about that, but if there is that will. So, for instance, one of the major flaws of the Constitution is that it makes a federative council, sort of an upper chamber or a second chamber of parliament, the object of legislation by the Council of Representatives. Well, that's a huge theoretical flaw, but it can actually be used to, because it's a matter of legislation, it sort of lowers the temperature than if it were a matter of constitutional amendment. So you can use Parliament to pass a legislation, for instance, to create this federative council, maybe even give it a sunset clause to see if it can work. But because it's legislation, you can experiment with it. The point of that would be to activate what the Iraqi constitution calls for, which is decentralization, for instance, across the board. Now, the Iraqi constitution permits but does not require federalization, but it calls upon decentralization generally. And the theory is that that produces better government. Now, there's reason to be skeptical about that too, but on the other hand, it can be given a try, and it would satisfy some of the demands of some of the regions. Basra, for instance, wants more control, more local control. I think a federative council, so enacted, could play a role in that. And as I said, it would be a matter of legislation. You could sunset it to see what works, what doesn't work, etc. There are other things that Parliament can do today. There have been proposals for creating a development board, as there had been in the late 1940s and 1950s, to assist in the economic development of the country and so on. So the things that Parliament can do today that don't even really require a grand bargain, they require some bargaining, but some compromises along the way. But there are things that Parliament can do tomorrow. If there were the political will to do so. And I think the international community has a role in advising on those things. And my hope is that some of that will happen.
Thank you. And apologies if I keep touching my phone. I've switched onto it, and there are a lot of buttons on there going crazy. Dr. Asadi, if I can switch to you, one of the major themes of this report is security sector reform, and in particular the fact that it is connected to so many of the political and economic challenges that the country faces. Now, there are many different facets of this question, but internationally, the one that attracts the most attention is the question of the Hashid, of a constellation of militias of all different political stripes, all different political allegiances. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the challenges and the discussions you had around the challenges of integration, of repositioning, and really kind of how you see the future of efforts to integrate the Hashid into the state.
Well, thank you very much, Louisa. Before going to answering your question, I just would like to see how it is linked to the idea of a grand bargain. Actually, we're here in front of more a plan than just a report. It talks about all these problems that are facing the policymakers and the stakeholders, including the security issue. But why I'm saying it is very much linked to the idea of a grand bargain again, because before talking about any bargain, we need to develop a grand sort of narrative that is embraced by all stakeholders and by all players, that is embraced by all policymakers. And this narrative is not necessarily about the grievances and the challenges that these parties or these players are facing. It is about how they intend to date, how they intend to establish the government. And this narrative has never been agreed upon yet. And since 2003, there is kind of struggle for power between players. And there's this kind of seeking more power positions in order to undermine others' positions. And that's why we haven't developed yet a narrative or a national identity, or even a worldview of how Iraq should be in the future, and how Iraq should be governed, by what kind of authority, by what kind of system. And all this sheds into or casts its shadow on security issue. Now, people are talking about the necessity of integrating the Hashd al-Sha'bi or any paramilitary forces or any groups into the military institution in Iraq, while others are talking about the distrust existing between these powers and the official institution. They are talking about the distrust and the inability to entrust or to feel protected by the official institution. They believe that the decision has been hijacked by external powers. They cannot feel comfortable, they cannot feel protected, they cannot feel safe within the country, and then they have to take it on their hands, and they have to protect their existence. It is more an existential problem for most of them. Others would say that this is against the state building idea, and this undermines all the efforts to empower the government, whether it is the central government, the federal government, or the local governments. And they argue that any kind of having or establishing parallel powers to the federal power or to the power of the state means that any party doing this doesn't have any belief in a state building, or doesn't have any belief in stabilizing Iraq. And this argument goes further, because there has not been yet an agreement over what kind of government most of all Iraq or all of Iraqis are seeking. And this is not just the case between Sunni and Shia and the Kurds. This goes deeper to the grassroots level. I'm talking daily to people who are ordinary people who come from the streets. They say whatever decisions are taken in Baghdad do not concern us. Are just concerned about the stability and security and the delivery of services, no matter what kind of system or government they are going to have in Baghdad. While others who are also influential on the streets, they are saying, no, we are fed up with this kind of federal system, we need a presidential system. So we have this kind of clash between what people on the streets are aiming at and what kind of argument is going at the elites level, which very much influences the decisions taken on the security level, very much influences the policies that are taken by the government. And they will influence and impact the future decisions, whether they are taken by the parliament or any legislations passed by the parliament, because at the end of the day, they will be under the influence and the pressure of the people in the street. So we have these intricate issues to solve before going to the discussion at the top level. We need these issues to solve, to convince all players that whatever kind of plan we are proposing should come from the reality, should come from the realistic, whether they are kind of theory or realistic needs and necessities of the press, different, whether in the streets or by media or whatever means. And this is really the core of the issue as I get it.
I'm curious to know sort of, how, but to go further, how you move these discussions into reality. There is currently a concept of a new national dialogue that might take place in Iraq, and it's not the first. It probably won't be the last. How can you bring the elite and society together? What options are there? What routes in? And how does the message best travel?
I think one of the measures we need to take is having a kind of relation or at different levels, at the down level, at the bottom level. This kind of reconciliation should be not just between politicians and decision makers. It should be between people, between communities, between social actors. And it is not a matter of seeking appeasement or strengthening between different communities. It is a matter of developing one narrative and one identity towards embracing and adopting this kind of worldview, which is shared by all Iraqis. And this step, unfortunately, has never been started. It's been started by the government. It also has never been started by Iraq friends and the international. With all the respect to the European Union and all organizations that have tried to establish this kind of discourse between all the Iraqis and this reconciliation approach to let it, given the idea that they cannot reach this kind of conclusion. So we need to start the project
I'm not sure if that's your internet, Doctor, or mine, but if everyone can hear me, if anyone would like to just nod if they can. Can you hear me, guys? Thank you. So if just, Mr. Worthington, if I can bring you in, one of the main things the report also focuses on is the major economic crisis that Iraq has been facing in recent months. The COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent plunge in oil prices has left the government, frankly, unable to pay its bills kind of pretty much at the baseline. And that is before it comes on to anything that looks like, serious reform, that looks like paying more than salaries, pensions, and other baseline costs. So going forward, what are the biggest economic challenges that you see, and what role, if any, is there for the international community to help?
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this panel this morning. Certainly, I think you're correct. The Iraqi economy is currently in very dire straits. It is fragile. It is multi-dimensional in nature, as others on this program have indicated. It is hit record deficits, both in budgetary terms as well as on its external accounts. The good news, as I think we've all made reference here today, is that the current government seeks, and I think a very genuine way, the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Ali Alawi, to put the country on both simultaneously on both a medium term course correction with its white paper that talks about long-term structural reform, and also seeks in its current budget to address many of the short-term economic challenges that Iraq faces. There is, I think, while respecting certainly Iraqi sovereignty, the need to come to grips within Iraq. It's a domestic issue. It's not centrally an international issue. The citizen-state relationship, as Ambassador Huth and others have referenced. There is, I think, another supporting dialogue that should take place between Iraq, various centers of power, including the national government itself, and the international community, in particular the international financial community. I would make note of what I think is a noteworthy, remarkable alignment in recent months, and this has been developing over the last 6 to 8 months plus, between the international financial institutions' prescriptions for reform in the Iraqi economy and the content the pathway forward that is outlined in the white paper that was released this past October. There is room, without involving necessarily financial resources, without certainly increasing security presence, but there is room for constructive, structured dialogue, I think, between the international financial community and the leadership of Iraq. We've seen very recently, for example, within the category of international financial institutions, the IMF be quite supportive of the white paper that was published back in October. It also praised, although noting its complexities, the budget that was introduced. The IMF was supportive of the devaluation of the Iraqi currency last December. And it plays a supporting role, I think, in terms of injecting not only ideas, but some sustainability because of its ongoing interest in structural reform of the Iraqi economy. Among governments, I think US and the European Union, as well as regional players, need to elevate the political significance, the political priority that they give to structural economic reform. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean new financial resources, but ideas have power, relationship has power, encouragement has power. And we see this, for example, with the recent last October Iraqi Economic Contact Group that was launched in London under the auspices of the UK, and Germany was also very much involved in that. We've seen in the past the role that the G7, under proper political leadership, has played in the agenda on Iraq. It was a factor back in 2016 when Prime Minister Abe, when he led the presidency of the G7, was instrumental in encouraging the last IMF standby arrangement between the IMF and Iraq. And there's also room, I think, for expanded, higher prioritized bilateral dialogue, quiet, discreet, that can provide a source of encouragement, new ideas, sustainability, discipline, and serves as a kind of framework for moving on the kind of agenda that's been set forth in the white paper. Now, that's not to exclude the possibility of new resources. External deficits are large. Iraq's external debt to GDP has dramatically increased. The IMF, I think, and possibly even the current government in Iraq might be receptive. I mean, if one reads the report from the IMF's executive board last week, it views in a positive way medium-term financial support and even emergency support for Iraq's economy. So I think there is a growing basis for an expanded international dialogue between the leadership in Iraq and the international financial community. Its political significance needs to be elevated, I believe.
I mean, one of the elephants in the room when it comes to the Iraqi economy, no matter how much money is poured in from the outside or not, is the way in which it's structured, right? The over-reliance on oil, and we've seen
the structural issues, the budget, the fiscal challenges, the planning process, the civil service, and also the necessity to deal with the large youth unemployment. There is no solution, in my view, to that without an expansion of the private sector, which means a redefinition of the role of the state in the economy. That's where the jobs of the future will come from. 60% of Iraq's population, I believe, is under the age of 25. There's 700,000 new entrants into the labor market potentially every year, but yet at least 40% unemployment in that age group. And I do not see a solution that is sustainable in a political sense without addressing that very serious demographic challenge and unemployment among the young. And I think Dr. Pfaff's excellent paper sketches some of the approaches that could serve to address that. The infrastructure area, which he references, provides the basis for expanded employment, particularly in the construction industry. Iraq's needs in the infrastructure space are enormous. But it requires a reallocation of resources and a sense of political priority on that element.
Okay, I see a raised hand from Ambassador Blacour. I'll bring you in.
Well, I think, as you can see, there's a remarkable convergence between actually the different participants in this report, and I think we all share a very similar outlook, the analysis, the diagnosis. But for me, I would like to come back to a point that was raised by Ambassador Wren, that is the interlocking nature of the challenges and the problems. Whenever we address one of them, we are immediately faced with another one and another one. I mean, it's like a set of Russian dolls. And the question of the structure of the state, the question of economic reforms, and the question of security arrangements, they all come back at the end to the same problem. And I think when it was discussed by my fellow panelists, the question of the crisis of identity or the crisis of legitimacy, the cry of the protesters, the Nuri al-Watani, is like, is this a precondition or this is a result from this process? I mean, will this legitimacy come from the process of a new great bargain or a new political setup, or is it going to be a precondition that we need to achieve before actually we can address the problems? I think we are facing here a kind of Gordian knot that we need to cut. We need to find a way in which these interlocking problems are basically dealt with the same instrument. That's why I thought that we need to set up a certain course in which the political elites cannot just reshuffle the cards and then keep the merry-go-round going, because first of all there's an economic constraints, and I think Mr. Wellington have pointed at the dire straits of the economy. The income of the state cannot sustain anymore the previous grand bargain. That I think also is not that stable, because it's not that it has been unchanged. Dawa party was pretty much pushed aside by the new political role of the Hashid. So the new players that come into the game. The question is, what does not change is the system to distribute the spoils between those who can actually put enough pressure on the state institutions. So in order to break that vicious circle and turn it around, I think it is absolutely essential that a political dialogue takes place that creates the environment, or I think it was the narrative, Dr. Dial-Assadi mentioned, that may restore the legitimacy in front of the citizens. Otherwise, we will keep going around in circles, being unable to really address the problems that we know very well what they are and we can identify, but we are unable to treat. Thank you.
I mean, as you say, this the shuffling of the cards, the difficulties in breaking the cycle has been sort of one of the most common, almost one of the most long-standing, I suppose, features of the system for a long time now. And I wonder, with this national dialogue, why is now the time for it? Why is it different? We've had so many different proposals for national dialogues in the past, right? Every few years there's another attempt. What is it about this moment, and what is it about the approach that will happen this time that will make it different and that will make that the conditions sort of riper for a breaking of the cycle?
Well, I think there is one initial point that this situation different, and is the economic situation does not allow the state or those parties that could use the state resources before to basically as an anesthetic instead of addressing the real problems. Well, you are run of anesthetics. Now, either you operate or the patient may enter into a fatal course. And then I think the international or regional context may offer an opportunity at the moment. We'll see how the new US administration addresses that. But I think the role of the international community will be critical. And the fact that this report is born with the vocation of advocating this sort of triangular US, EU, and Iraqi track, I think is pretty much at the right time.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on to some questions from the audience now. Bear with me as I read them off my phone. So the first question is from Jonathan Lord. It says, are we not seeing the Muhassasa break down, or at least evolve, as Shia, Sunni and Kurdish political parties break ranks, cross-sectarian lines, and create cross-sectarian alliances to win access to resources and positions? And I think this is sort of one of the most important themes here, and I wonder if anyone wants to jump in there. Dr. Dia, what do you think?
Louisa, can I comment on this?
Sorry, I think.
Hello?
Would you like me to go on? Okay, go ahead, please, Dr. Rahim.
No, sorry, after you.
It's okay, never mind.
Okay.
Ladies first.
So, am I speaking? Okay. I think that, yes, whereas what we have seen more than the crossing, going across sectarian lines, what we have seen more is a fragmentation of political, prior political solidarity within the sectarian boundaries. That is much more the characteristic of the political landscape today, rather than cross-sectarian alliances and so on. It's not that there aren't. In fact, there were as well in 2018. There are a few, and I won't cite them because that may cause problems. There are a few, but they are, by the way, they're Shia driven. And I think that's an important point. And in my eyes, it makes them less credible. But really, I don't think we can make too much of this cross-sectarian alliances and so on. What we saw in 2018 was all Shia driven. What we're seeing, the few initiatives we're seeing now is also Shia driven. And in any case, as I said, the fragmentation within the sects is the more pronounced feature of the political landscape. Sorry to jump in like this.
Dr. Sadi, if you want on that, that would be great.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much again. I think the problem is still persisting, the problem of identification or definition, actually, because we don't have an agreed upon terminology here. Muhassasa is either seen as benign or malignant, depending on the view from which you look at it. Some parties would think that al-muhassasa is very good for their existence. I mean, I have heard it from senior leaders in Kurdistan and some of the Sunni governorates. They say that without muhassasa, we cannot have our share of power. Some of the Shia would think that without muhassasa, they will be persecuted again and there will be subjugated, and then some other parties would dominate Iraq. So despite the fact that they all claim that they are fighting al-muhassasa, they don't want a system that is based on al-muhassasa. So when we talk about al-muhassasa, they will introduce it as if it were protecting their community's share of power, protecting the existence of their communities. While in fact they are protecting, we know very well they are protecting their political gains, their existence as parties and as leaders. But this problem is that this term and this concept is being marketed by most of these players as if it were something to guard or to protect the share of power of their communities or the communities from which they come. In order to undermine this kind of manipulation, or to put an end for this kind of manipulation, we need to introduce our jargon, our terminology, actually. The terminology that should be embraced by all those who are seeking the correction and the reform of the political process, including those who participated in putting forward this report. The noble objective is very clear. The methodology is well set and well expressed, but they are going to face, and those who are going to embrace this report, they are going to face the same problems when this is being put into practice, starting from terminology, ending to methodology and the objectives.
Well, thanks for that, Ambassador Istrabadi. Do you have a comment?
Yes, I do. I am absolutely on board with placing the lion's share of the fault for the Muhassasa system on Iraq's elites. Some of us were there before 2003, and some were there before I got there in the 90s, to see it develop and as it evolved, and then to become what it became post 2003. But keep in mind, I mean, if all we've been doing is reshuffling the deck, as I think Ambassador Blekwa said, part of the reason for that is that the people of Iraq keep electing the same political actors. They keep electing and re-electing the same political actors. And so that, and I myself personally don't expect that to change very much in October. I don't think we're going to get a clear result that rejects the Muhassasa in October if elections are held then. So then the question becomes, what can you do with the existing, not just the existing system, but the existing players? Now, I do think I agree with those who have said that the incentive for reform comes from the fact that the state of Iraq has become economically unsustainable. It is on the verge of collapse, unable to pay salaries. And that is simply not a recipe for, getting through month to month, let alone the long term. So that said, the fundamental problem is that there is at least a segment of the population of Iraq that has not rejected the political parties that brought Muhassasa. And I think we keep talking every time there's an election in Iraq, we sort of become optimistic again that this time the electorate will get it right. And I think there's room for skepticism. And if that's what happens, if I'm right about that, then I think the question is, well, then what can be done to avoid a state collapse? And I think that at least has to be somewhere in the background of the discussions of international actors as they sort of look forward to see in the next 6 months and the next year what their role with the Iraqis may be, it may not be in October that we get a rejection of this system as it's existed in the last 16 years or so, in which case the question is then what? And I think the report has some guideposts for that ought not to be ignored if this new grand bargain we all hope for doesn't in fact obtain.
Well, thank you for that. I'm now going to move on to our next question that comes from Barbara Slavin. How would reduction in tensions between the US and Iran affect Iraq? Or is Iran so entrenched in the Iraqi political system that the impact would be minimal? How would sanctions relief for Iran affect the Iranian economy? And probably by extension, we could ask the Iraqi economy as well, or its relations with Iraq. Who would like to take that one? Okay, Ambassador Blakua, you're on.
I guess that it's an extremely tricky question because the balance between that the Iraqi government has tried to establish between its relationship with Iran and its relationship with the US is pretty much at the heart of the different political balances that there are. Although we should not forget that also Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf are extremely involved, and they're also players in here. I think, in my view, sometimes it's easy to either put on Iran or on the US the onus on the political distortions on the Iraqi situation. I think that the example that we recently lived in which there was an unofficial cooperation between Iran and the US in the fight against Daesh, and the success that the international coalition had in that endeavor, is pretty much a good example on how the Iraqi political situation is sometimes hostage of these elements. I think that certainly if there is a general political understanding between the US and Iran, that will be an element that will facilitate the situation or the finding possible internal solutions. Is also, I think I would like to point out that often when we think that the Iraqis or the Iraqi different factions are proxies of these different external players, sometimes it's actually the opposite. First of all, because Iraq is a rich country. Iraq has important resources, and many of the players that actually align themselves with other external actors they do not need payment or financial contributions from outside. So sometimes they use and manipulate the different external actors in their own games. So it's a very complex and multi-layered situation in which the fact that Iraq or Iraqi actors have at the same time this international connection to external patrons plays both ways, and is not in only one direction. So the question may be simple, the answer certainly is not, but I would like to say, and I have actually wrote about it, and I still believe that this is the truth, that Iraq can turn that situation in which the external pressures are certainly a complication into an asset. Iraq can be the bridge builder in the region, because none of the countries of the region can afford Iraq to be on the other side if there is a confrontation. So Iraq, in its relative weakness, still holds the key for any viable security architecture in the region. So I believe that there is a possibility for Iraq to really turn that relative weakness, and we all know that the interference interference of foreign actors is frequently a distortion and a problem into part of the solution. In any case, I don't think there is a choice because the realities, the geopolitical realities are as they are. But I think there is also a positive angle in which Iraq can be that bridge that can hold this sort of security architecture, because even with an agreement between Iran and the US on the JCPOA or the nuclear issue, that will not solve the dynamics, the political dynamics in the region and the tensions that exist between the different players.
Ambassador Rahim, I'm curious to know how you'd come back at this point.
Louisa, were you addressing me? Yes. Well, thank you, Ambassador Lekwa. I completely concur that, I think of Iraq as a sort of being the epicenter of a lot of sort of the fractures, the regional fractures, or the crossroad of all those regional fractures. And although that weakens it enormously, yet at the same time, it makes it the sort of central point of a regional security architecture, because of the confluence of so many conflicting ethnicities, political interests, and so on. It really makes Iraq the fulcrum. I don't know that the Iraqi government, current or previous governments, have ever seen themselves in that way. Maybe this government more than others. I think Mr. Kadhimi and his cabinet probably recognize are beginning to recognize that potential role that they have, but it really hasn't been obvious, or at least it hasn't been spotlighted. And the problem really begins in terms of, and here I would defer to Ambassador Strabadi. I mean, right from 2003 and the writing of the Constitution, the Iraqis who were engaged did not state a mission for Iraq. I mean, what is Iraq about after these decades of wars and suffering and sanctions and so on? What should Iraq be about? What is Iraq's role in the region? What is its vision for itself? And I think this lack of sort of corporate thinking, if you want, about what do we do internally to make this country work? And what is our role externally within the region? I think that's a dialogue that really has to happen within Iraq. If we're talking about a grand bargain, if we're talking about national dialogue, I think this issue about where do we stand and what is our role, and to recognize that the very weaknesses that as you referred to them, are in fact strengths for Iraq, or could be used as strength if we are smart, or if Iraqis are smart.
There we go. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in here about the role of the private sector in sort of diversifying the economy. Mr. Worthington, can I ask you, what if any role can the international community play in sort of helping small to medium-sized businesses in, creating a more favourable investment environment? What would you say there?
Well, I think the international financial community does have a significant role to play. It's a supporting role. The framework for economic reform, for long-term budgetary stability, for long-term redirection of the economy toward the private sector must come from the Iraqi state. It cannot be in any way imposed from the outside. But the international community can play, as I had said earlier, I think a significant role in encouraging direction. It can do that through its expertise, sharing of its expertise through consultation mechanisms such as the IMF Article 4, the World Bank's country program framework, and that can have a stabilizing effect on the direction, I think, of reforms within Iraq. That international involvement too, I think, is important in terms of perceptions by the private investment community, international investment community. Its involvement, its commentary, its endorsement on particular policies sends signals to those that are willing to or prepared to consider investment in Iraq. And Iraq certainly needs outside capital if it's to private capital if it's to move forward. There does remain in the background the possibility of a standby arrangement between Iraq and the international financial community, specifically the IMF. There have been 4 of those, actually, since 2004. They've had various degrees of effectiveness, probably overall, certainly not as effective as everyone hoped at the time. But they do inject policy conditionality into the situation. And that policy conditionality, I think, can serve as a sustaining framework because it tends to keep policy within a certain set of guide rails.
We have another question here that I think you would be quite well placed to answer, if I can just pull it up. Why has reform and restricting of the state banking sector not proceeded despite overwhelming support from IFIs? Who is accountable for pushing this through, and what follows from here?
Yeah. Yes, I think the reform of the financial sector is one of the top 3 or 4 priorities on the economic agenda, because it provides a source long term, if it functions well, of movement of capital into the private sector. The system is still the financial system. It's state dominated. By several big banks that need to be restructured, and it's, I would say, a system that's riddled with corruption, where profitability, for example, is made off of the foreign exchange mechanism. Rather than lending to the real economy. And there needs to be a general overhaul of that system. There is certainly, this is another area where international expertise, both public and private, can have an impact. My very clear sense is that the finance minister, Deputy Prime Minister Ali Alawi, is committed to doing what he can by way of reform of the financial system, and he's looking at many of the fundamentals that need to be addressed, some of which I have just mentioned. And the international community again needs to shore up that very strong inclination. There may be certain outside resources that could be brought to bear, but this is certainly an area of priority because it is the intermediary that moves capital into private hands, and it's particularly important as to small business. It's also linked, I think, to the regulatory reform for small business in general. And again, the state involvement in that process needs to be reduced so parties can be freed up. There may be the need for certain new funds created that provide incentives, government-sponsored, for lending into the private sector, particularly for small business purposes.
Thank you. I think we don't have very long left. So, given that this is a report about the role, or partly about the role of the international community and, what role it can play in Iraq, I think it will be no surprise to anyone to be reminded that Iraq is no stranger to the international community of all different nations kind of coming in, trying to nudge, trying to mold, trying to change the political system. And I wonder if we could just go around the table and ask at this stage, what constructive role exists now for the international community? What can it helpfully do in Iraq that does not leave it as a pawn for countries that have put it in the middle, which does not leave it as a sort of a reform project from Western capitals? Ambassador Burka, what do you think?
Well, thank you, Liz. I wouldn't like to take too much of the remaining time, because I do believe that the international community is there to support an Iraqi process. And I think that really the Iraqi different actors are the ones who have to take the lead. There is a very key element in which the external actors or the international community, European Union or the US and others, could actually play a role, and is in helping bridge the trust deficit, that gap that may prevent the Iraqi actors from actually reaching a deal, a ground bargain, or whatever kind of dialogue results. I think some political agreements may require that external assistance for this trust gap to be reached. But I would like to leave actually the floor to the Iraqi co-panelists, because they are the ones who have to tell us really which role we can play, because that is what we are there to do, as best supporting actors, not replacing their role in this process.
Dr. Dia, what do you think? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you again. I think there are so many measures and roles that can be assumed by our international community friends and international players, starting with helping Iraq to integrate within its regional network of countries or regimes or systems. Because, most of the countries have unfortunately lost confidence in the new government of Iraq since 2003, thinking that this is going to be a threat for their existence, while Iraq was just trying to rebuild itself and recover from the past atrocities. And the second role is to endorse all the ongoing process, despite all the oddities and all the hiccups. All the critiques directed towards the successive Iraqi governments has its ground, actually. But we need also to regain the world trust and the necessity of establishing a powerful country in the region, especially in the position of Iraq, because it will impact in one way or another all the region and the world, with all the resources that Iraq has and all the geopolitical position that it can play. So these are among the measures and the roles that can be taken. Also, the trying to support Iraq to not just empower itself, but to correct the wrong process that has been going, to establish good governance and make this as a mandate, as a precondition before extending any support. And without establishing all the good governance measures and pre-requirements, it wouldn't be possible for any external player or external country or friend, whatever system, can give any support and help to Iraq without having a working and viable system in Iraq, a sustainable system. And this system should be based on good governance, not on hegemony or any other kinds of manipulation of the political process.
Thank you, Doctor. Ambassador Shribadi, what constructive role exists for the international community right now in Iraq?
Louisa, are you addressing me?
Either you or Ambassador Shribadi. Sorry, my mic is
Professor.
clearly not picking things up.
Suddenly then, go ahead.
You know, the problem, I think, Louisa's voice is muted or arrives to me muted. So I'm never quite sure. But okay, I'll go ahead. Just to add to what Liat said, I want to sort of think that the international community will recognize. First of all, I'm very glad that we now see an opportunity for the international community to work together as opposed to work separately during the former US administration. I think there's more chance for collective action. But what is really necessary is to recognize that the financial and economic support that the international community is giving to Iraq, which is commendable, admirable, and so on, that it cannot be separated from political reform. You can't do economic and financial reform without at the same time addressing political reform. So just take an example. If we're talking about the white paper, it is essential for corruption to be tackled. And corruption is not just a financial problem that we have, it is also a political problem. If we talk about muhasasa, the economic and financial reform really should try to replace that by the notion of equity. Instead of muhasasa, we think of equity. And that again is a type of political reform. Any kind of economic and financial reform, as Liat said, depends on good governance, whatever we mean by good governance. It's a bit of a nebulous concept. It really needs to be broken down and so on. But it depends on a state that is able to deliver goods and services equitably and to run its affairs efficiently. So there are no economic and financial reforms which do not imply political reforms. And I think I want to encourage the international community to recognize that these are twins and not to shy away and say, well, we're not going to advocate and we're not going to support issues of political reform because that's politics, it's internal. Well, yes, but if you're supporting economic reform, you must, alongside of it, in tandem, and implicitly, explicitly really, speak what is implicit, which is that the two are tied together. Sorry for being too long. Thank you.
Not at all. Ambassador Faisal.
Well, thank you. I want to, I think Ambassador Rahim said something very important about the Iraqis, and this was one of the failures of the post-2003 period, both in the period of drafting the interim never sort of decided what it is that the state of Iraq was about and what their role was both internally and sort of, but for purposes of this question, externally. So the first issue is, I think the Iraqi political class, whatever that looks like today or 6 months from now or a year from now, has to come to a decision about what role it wants to play in the region. Hopefully it will not be a role of factions again in the hands of different parties in in the region. But then I think also the international community, and here I'm specifically addressing the United States, because I think for too long across several administrations, there really has not been an Iraq policy as such. I think successive American administrations have had other regional policies, including most obviously an Iran policy in which Iraq played an adjunct role. That was very clear in the last 4 years, but it was also true largely in the Obama administration. And I want to tie that into the question that Barbara Slavin asked about relations between the US and Iran and how that what impact that has on Iraq. I think one thing policymakers have to keep in mind, whether in Brussels or in Washington or in other European capitals, is that for Iran, it is a matter of sort of a priority for Iran that the state of Iraq always be weak. And so I think that there is an appropriate role for the United States, however the larger regional issues. And I said the United States, I meant the international community. Whatever the larger regional issues between Iran and the Security Council and the United States and the JCPOA and all of that, if there is an interest in the international community, as I believe there is, and certainly in the regional powers, the other regional states, for Iraq to survive as such, not to play an oversized role as it came to in the 80s and the 70s and 80s, but to play a natural role in the region and in regional politics. Then there's an interest in the international community to help the Iraqis to bring that result about. Not to impose solutions, as Mr. Wethington keeps reminding us, but to help the Iraqis, particularly with technical issues, with good offices, to make that result come about. And again, yes, the reforms are all interlinked. You can't succeed in the economic reforms without the political reforms. There is a role for the international community to play in mediating and facilitating and providing technical expertise. And I hope that the world will re-engage. There has been an Iraq fatigue to some extent, or so it appears, I think, to Iraqis. My hope is that the world community, the international community, will re-engage in Iraq. Thank you.
I think that's a good moment, Mr. Wellington, for the final point to go to you in terms of the US role. A lot of people are addressing their points explicitly at Washington today. What is the most constructive thing that DC can be doing at this stage to help at least Iraq get to a better place? A question for you, Mr. Wethington. You can hear me?
I'm sorry, you talked to me or somebody? It's not clear. You're very soft spoken, which I'm not accustomed to.
I am. I apologize. Yeah, just I mean, final question for the day. A lot of the comments have been directed at the United States. We've spoken a lot about international involvement, particularly how that becomes constructive, and what would your sort of number one recommendation be for the new administration in terms of constructive engagement with Iraq?
Well, I mean, just that, I think, develop an Iraq policy. There hasn't been one for a very long time that goes back, at least beyond the last 4 years. And so what is the American sort of vision for Iraq? If it's a stable Iraq that is, that can govern itself decently and be a reliable partner, a reliable ally in the region, then there has to be an engagement with Iraq to bring that result about. The United States cannot expect Iraq to adopt its policies. The previous administration expected Iraq to take the same hostile stand towards Iran that it had. Iraq cannot do that. Look at a map. It's the longest border Iraq shares with any country is with Iran. Iraq has to balance its relations with three much more powerful neighbors: Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And I think it's in the United States' interest do so, which means developing a policy for encouraging just that. Once again, the United States can't impose, but it has good offices, it has influence. There was a point in the Obama administration when we were hearing that the United States doesn't have influence in Iraq, which was patently untrue then, it's untrue now. So I think just engaging with the Iraqis, encouraging the Iraqis to develop this sort of model that I think is in the United States interest, which is since Turkey doesn't seem to be using the Kemalist phrase, let's apply it in Iraq, and in Iraq that has peace at home and peace abroad.
Thank you. Well, I think we've gone a little bit over time, so it's a good moment to wrap this up. I'd like to thank our panelists for this today, the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Huth for his keynote speech. And yeah, I'd encourage everyone to read the report and keep talking. Thanks, guys.